Hello, metric students. We're going to have at least one more lecture here about instrument variables. What I want to talk about is an actual example, a couple questions about how exactly the instrument separates out those components. So I want to use our example that we've talked about with class. And how a potential conflict in class can help us get at the two different components of attending a study session. So if you remember, our diagram that we had been working with was we had x, our variable that is independent, impacting our dependent variable y. But we also were worried that there were some endogeneity problems, where other factors that influence y also impact our variable of interest x. So what we were talking about in this chapter, in this section, was the idea that there might be some instrument z that is independent of our error term, but has some impact or influence on x. If that's the case, then we can separate out x into two different components. One that is independent of the error term, and one that is still potentially an endogenous factor. Now, the example that we're going to use is how attending a study session impacts your grade. And we're going to think about having some sort of scheduling conflict as being our main variable that is going to be our instrument. So if you have a schedule conflict, that's a legitimate schedule conflict, like you previously had a meeting scheduled before the professor decided when the study session was, that is probably going to be independent of other things that impact grade, but is going to impact attendance on the study session. So that's going to allow us to separate out one portion of studying that showing up to the study session that is exogenous or independent from that schedule conflict. So let's think through an example where we have two students. Alex, who doesn't attend the study session because he's just plain lazy. However, because he's lazy, he also skips some classes. He also doesn't read the textbook and barely even does the labs. So he just kind of does the bare minimum for labs. And if we contrast that with Sam, Sam is hardworking, goes to the study session, never ever misses a class, reads the whole textbook and rereads portions of it, works hard to understand the labs. So we can see that these two students are different. If we can think about Alex versus Sam, and we have the exam, we could say maybe Alex gets a lower score, about a 70 maybe. Sam gets a high score, an 86. Sam went to the study session. Alex did not. Sam scored 16 points higher than Alex. Is this difference what we're after? Is this difference capturing the impact of the study session? Probably not. And probably not because of these other factors that are correlating with attendance at the study session. There's differences in the class attendance. There's differences in how much they read the textbook. There's difference in how much effort they put in understanding the labs. Now let's think of another example here with two different students. Max, he doesn't attend because he has a conflict. He had a meeting at that time or something. Occasionally he'll miss class. He reads the textbook, does the labs, he has questions. And Ash is very similar. However, Ash goes to the study session. But in terms of class attendance, in terms of the textbook, in terms of doing the labs, looks very similar to Max. So if we compare Max and Ash, and we look at how they did on the exams, Max got a 75, Alex got a 81. So there was this 6-point difference in their exam grades. Would we expect that this 6-point difference is because of the study session? Maybe. Because what we have is across those other variables, that other stuff, the error term, class attendance, textbook reading, lab thoroughness, they are similar in these other components that impact grade. The reason they differed in their attendance to the study session wasn't because one was hardworking and one was lazy, it was because of the conflict. That's what we're trying to get at with an instrument variable. Now, this is an example here with these 4 different people, but what we're doing with an instrument variable is applying it to a larger set. Now, let's think through this in sort of a numerical sense here, how this works. What we need to be true for our instrument, and we're just doing our dummy variable instrument, which is the simplest form that we can have. But what we need to be true for a good instrument is that it's not related to the error term. And in particular, whether or not you had a study conflict, a schedule conflict in this example needs to not be related to what your grade would have been. Regardless of the study session. So the schedule conflict, we can see here that apart from that study session, your expected grade needs to be the same in this example with the conflict or not, 75. I'm going to also do an example here in Stata to show you with some simulated data how this works aside from just with 4 people. So the other causes need to be unrelated to Z. Now let's think through what happens in this study session. Let's say that a full quarter of the class can't attend because of that conflict. What I want to talk about here is that this idea of X hat, the predicted value of X coming from the schedule conflict. Now this isn't X itself is a 1 or 0 variable. It's a dummy variable about whether or not you attended. So if you had a conflict, we're assuming here that you don't attend. You don't sort of decide to skip the conflict. That would mess up a little bit our exogeneity constraint, because maybe if you really need the study session or something like that, then that's not going to be the best in terms of getting our exogeneity constraint there. So we're going to say that a quarter of the class had that conflict, 75% of the class did not. Of that, 2/3 of the people go. And what we're doing here is we're going to ignore the differences between the people that are going and not going. We're going to remove that variation that is tied to that other stuff impacting grade, tied to motivation, correlated with reading the textbook. And we're going to eliminate that variation and consider basically everybody who doesn't have a conflict. We're going to think of them as the same. Let me illustrate this with the 4 people that we have. So in terms of X itself, attending the study session, we had Alex not going because he had a conflict, and Sam attending, Max not going, and Ash going. Sorry, I believe Max had the conflict and Alex was lazy. This is attendance. Now let's think about who had the conflict. And we could look at, we also could look at the average grade for attending versus not attending. And if you do the math of what the numbers I put up, we get that the average grade is an 83. In terms of the conflict, only Max had the conflict. Ash, Sam, and Alex didn't have the conflict. But only Ash and Sam attended, Alex did not. What we're going to do is wipe away this difference. We're going to ignore variation coming from other stuff. And so what we're going to do is ignore that difference in actual attendance that differs Ash and Sam from Alex, and we're only going to be looking at variation coming from the conflict. So what we're worried about is that variation from other stuff is potentially correlated with the error term. So we could also look at the average grades for people who had a conflict, Max, with people who did not, Ash, Sam, and Alex. And then we can predict attend hat, the predicted value of the attendance. Now, in this very simplified example where we have a dummy variable for our instrument, the predicted values are just going to be the average amount for the group. So for the group that had the conflict, nobody shows up. Our predicted attendance is 0. And then for this example, that's actually the true attendance. For the people that did not have the conflict, 2/3 of them ended up going. And so our predicted value is 0.67. Now, the important thing is that this applies to Ash, Sam, and Alex. It doesn't matter the fact that one of them didn't attend. We're ignoring that difference. We're eliminating it. That is the variation that we're separating it out. Now let's return to our causal diagram here, where we're showing the interplay between the conflict, the study session, and your grade on the exam. If the study session truly had no effect, if beta truly was 0, then what we would expect to see that is it wouldn't matter if you had a conflict, because all that would be influencing the grade would be other stuff. And because the conflict is independent of other stuff, if grade didn't have an impact, then we would see having a conflict being unrelated to grade, because we're thinking that the only channel that having a conflict actually impacts grade is through the study session itself. So if we look at the average grades, though, they are different between people who had a conflict and people who did not. They are higher for the people who did not have a conflict. Now, if our conditions hold, if the exclusion criteria and the inclusion criteria holds, this means that what we're seeing is the effect of the study session. Furthermore, what we are seeing is the effect only on people who are showing up. And we know that only 2 out of the 3 were showing up. So those are the ones that are showing the effect. So what we can do is, with that difference of 4 in the average grades between people who had a conflict and people did not, we can divide that or inflate that, because that difference of 4 is only coming from a portion of our sample, the affected portion, and say that, well, the impact for those 2 people that actually showed up, each of them probably had an impact of 6. Now, to close out what we're talking about for instrument variables, this is a very simple example. It's a dummy variable example. We can also have continuous instrument variables. It doesn't just have to be yes or no. We also have other x's that influence things, and we need to control for those when we're doing both our first and second stage in order to preserve this method. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to post a short video walking you through what happens when we have more people and how this same sort of logic applies.
because here we only have these four individuals, and this is a very constructed example, but I hope what you're getting at is the intuition that we are taking out any sort of variation that is happening because of people deciding to go because they're lazy, or not go because they're lazy, or deciding to go because they're hardworking. We're only looking at, did you have a conflict? That is the only source of variation in X that we are interested in. And we're using that to be able to identify and talk about the impact of X on Y. I hope you're all staying healthy and doing well. And I hope to see you all and interact with you soon. Take care.